Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, the co-host. Daniel, nice to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
I'm going to have a real challenging interview today because I understand there is a Daniel McAdams that put an article up on the Institute for Peace and Prosperity dealing with what the president has declared is an escalation, and you describe it as a major escalation in Syria, the place where we feel so happy about being in and spending our money. But it raises a question of why are we there in the first place? Of course, we all remember we went in there to save these Yazidis. So I guess, are they in trouble again? Is that why we're back in there? And isn't it pretty amazing, how long this goes on? First, we have this amazing announcement out of the clear blue. Assad has to go, which is a virtual declaration of war until we get rid of Assad. Way back in 2011, then you have an incident that stirs up the hearts of the people because the children and the innocent are suffering and dying. So this was the early stages, but it looks like, as we expected and predicted, it hasn't ended, it's lingering, and it's not doing American security any good at all.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In 2011, when the administration declared Assad must go, and then 3 years passed and he didn't go. As a matter of fact, they fought back against this insurrection or this invasion. So that's why, and what's amazing is the power of propaganda. And that's why we always say that we actually not necessarily fighting war, but fighting war propaganda, because it really is the gateway to war. And so that's why in August of 2014, after President Obama had said, and I was just looking this up, the Washington Post of all places reported in 2015 that Obama had said 8 times he promised no ground troops in Syria. And then it came out in August of 2013. You can imagine them trying to figure out how can we get our babies in the incubator kind of story to get the Americans along on board. And then he said in 2014, just last year, these Yazidis, we got to rescue them. They're being treated badly. We got to go in there. So what I said, these 8 times has to go by the wayside. And of course, after we rescued them, then something else popped up, the Khorasan group, which most people will even forget because that was just Al-Qaeda, but they gave it a scary new name to justify an expansion at the time. That still hasn't done the trick, and so now we have a quintupling of U.S. troops in Syria.
And of course, we haven't heard too much yelling and screaming by those protectors in the Congress that would protect us against unnecessary war and protect the pocketbook and all these things. We don't hear much, and barely do we hear anything in the media. It made it as an announcement, but no real challenges. But it's not just in Syria. The escalations in different places. We know, we've talked about it just recently, the re-escalation in Iraq, and we haven't really left Afghanistan. And we're still allies with Saudi Arabia, and there's a war going on in Yemen. So this continues, but also, our friends at NATO are deciding they have to show that they're going to be tough because they're very worried. They're worried about the Russians taking over Eastern Europe, and therefore NATO wants to, increase their naval power in the Black Sea. The Black Sea, if you look at it geographically, it looks like a private lake from a couple countries there, Russia and Turkey and Romania and Bulgaria. But anyway, they're escalating there. And the Russians, there's no evidence the Russians have done anything with their Navy there. They have a decent-sized Navy, but what are they going to do? If we're going to NATO's going to put more ships in there, imagine, the Russians could say, well, are they getting ready to do something to us? So they would be justified in a response of saying, well, we have to continue to build a Navy in the Black Sea. Yet there's no evidence that they've even started to do this.
Well, we talked about this last week, the U.S. military action in the Baltic Sea, just 50 miles from Russian territory, which was the big thing last week. Well, this is something, and we first noticed it on antiwar.com today. They reported that, there's a problem because after the Treaty of Lausanne, after the First World War, in the run-up to the Second World War, it was obvious that this treaty needed to be revised, and this had to do with the passage through the Dardanelles, through Turkey into the Black Sea from the Mediterranean. And so the Montreux Treaty was signed, I think, in 1936, which revised the Lausanne Treaty and sort of brought it up to date. And one of the aspects of that treaty was how states that are not bordering the Black Sea can have naval vessels, military vessels in the Black Sea. And according to that treaty, no more than 9 non-bordering states ships can be in the Black Sea, and they can only stay for a maximum of 21 days. But the U.S., through NATO, and actually the U.S. Assistant Secretary General Sandy Vershbow, wants to ramp that up, the military presence. So the plan is to get our proxies, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, to build up their navy and bring them in there and aggravate the situation in the Black Sea more.
And I think that convention or treaty was limiting the size of the vessels
Yes,
too.
true,
They
yes.
couldn't bring in any size vessel. And it was not there. The rule wasn't. It was actually trying to prevent, a huge military buildup. So NATO is very much involved, and I guess we're NATO in the sense that we pay for it and most of it. But if we don't do it directly, we'll use somebody else to do it for us. But once again, is this whole idea that we have to build the fear, and it's actually shifted. When this started with Ukraine, I was so confident that the dependency on Russia for oil and gas in Europe, they would never consider this. And yet it keeps going on and on. Well, maybe they'll buy someplace else. The oil prices are down now. And usually when they're trading, and this still might exist, there's still probably some people dependent on trade, and this is still a lot of talk. But I'm disappointed, of course, personally, to think that it's gotten this far. But it just seems like we're determined. It's almost like an obsession that the Russians are coming, and yet they only see it from our point of view and never their point of view. But what would be the closest analogy to the Black Sea? The Great Lakes wouldn't be quite like the Black Sea, but the Gulf of Mexico might be. It's international waters. Can you imagine what we would do if there was a naval buildup of a foreign government with massive ships in the Gulf of Mexico? We wouldn't be very happy with that.
Or like we're having to use proxies. Just think if Russia had used the Cubans as proxies to build up a huge naval presence in the Gulf of Mexico, we wouldn't be happy. But this big presence will, if it is successful, will result in many more Western naval vessels in the Black Sea, and that won't be considered an escalation. Only any kind of Russian response will be aggression. But the origin of this is simply yet another example that the U.S. through NATO cannot abide Russian control over Crimea, which they had controlled, of course, for hundreds of years until the 50s. It's a response to the Russian naval presence in Crimea, which, of course, has always been there. Even when Crimea was Ukraine, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was headquartered there. Thousands and thousands of Russian sailors and troops were there. But now all of a sudden we have to put pressure on the Russians in Crimea, I guess, to force them to give it back, or somehow as if it's any of our business who controls Crimea.
Yeah, it might not hurt the military-industrial complex. They might get to build some vessels. The candidates generally, they're all saying we have to rebuild the military. And I keep wondering, when was it torn down? When did we lose very much? So rebuild it, and of course this is another excuse for doing it to keep rebuilding. But in Syria, they want to put more troops there. And the idea is, what are we protecting? Who knows what? But it's always, if you ask and they say, well, this is for national security reasons and national interest. But it never, as far as I'm concerned, for national security purposes, because to me, it undermines our security. What are we doing in the Black Sea defying it? Aren't we defying international law, or at least the implication by us saying, yes, we are going to march in there? And that's more or less why people get a little bit annoyed with us, because we sort of bully our way around the world.
What is fascinating about the Syria example is I think it demonstrates, first of all, the power of propaganda, which we pointed out, but also how the warmongers can suck the humanitarian interventionists into supporting war. And a lot of these are progressives who are tactical allies in some wars, but they get sucked into supporting war when it's presented as the R2P, which we've talked about, the responsibility to protect. That is, if a country within its own borders is not adequately protecting its population, then anyone around the world has the right to go in and use military force. And this really was adopted in 2006, this idea of R2P. But the left loves it. Samantha Power, Susan Rice, the left interventionists love it because it gives them a fig leaf of humanitarianism. But the results are the same as an aggressive war, say, under Bush. Look at Libya. Look at all of the humanitarian wars. The result is the same.
You know, all these areas I consider dangerous and prolong Afghanistan, Iraq, and now, you know, we're dealing with Syria and the Black Sea. The Black Sea, the way I see it, it's not quite as immediate because it's going to take a while to get ships and move them in and build up the animosities and deciding what to do and back and forth. But I don't think there's that much back and forth that's going to continue with Syria because we're putting more troops in and it won't go unnoticed. And the Russians had a lot to do by their support for Assad to push back on ISIS. And some reason, as we have spoken so many times, maybe our heart isn't really in getting rid of ISIS. You know, ISIS is fighting Assad, they're fighting each other, and we sort of support the enemies of Assad and this sort of thing. But if things don't go well for Assad, you know, if some of the things that he accomplished in the last 6 months, if that's reversed, Russia's not going to throw away what they've done. So I would suspect that Russia is more likely to be responding there than right now, you know, in the Black Sea. That may become a very hot spot, but I think we have to keep an eye on what's happening in Syria.
I think that's true. You know, they went in on the eve of the U.S. declaring a no-fly zone to preempt that, which would have precluded them from being involved at all if that had taken place. So they came in at the last moment and changed the facts on the ground. I think you're absolutely right. There's no reason to believe they wouldn't do that again if it got to that point.
Can you state any places that is more the public media that has given good credibility on these issues, you know, whether it's NATO in the Black Sea or putting troops in there? We get bare mentions of it, but there's, like I said earlier, there's no outrage by the Congress. I don't think, you know, I know you don't sit and watch TV, but you watch what goes through and what they are saying. But I don't think anybody's saying, you know, you better be a little bit careful. And the American people, where do you think they are? I think they're worrying too much about private individuals who own bathrooms telling people who being forced to let people in they don't want in their bathrooms. Some of these things that go on, and that just concentrates their attention. And who cares about this? 250 troops, that's nothing. We have 50 there, and we got to protect our national security. But it seems like there's a lot of people pretty asleep on these issues.
Yeah, it's bread and circuses. That seems to be what people want. They're getting it.
Yeah, that's for sure. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and we will keep you updated as we see it on the issues going on, as particularly in the Middle East. And what we have just seen recently is NATO threatening to put more vessels in the Black Sea and confront Russia for whatever reason. We see the continuation of the re-escalation in Iraq. And also, of course, our presence in Afghanistan exists as a problem, and our existence and our participation in the war against Yemen as a buddy for the Saudi Arabians, and it continues. But here again, as Daniel pointed out in his article on the Institute's site, it's the president announcing we're escalating, we're going in there, and it's considered a very serious thing, and I suggest that might lead to the Russians coming in. So there's a lot of problems going on. It all comes from this fact that we believe as a country, unfortunately, our leaders have led us into interventionism, and it has been sold to the American people that it's a benefit to us, and it's a benefit for peace and prosperity and liberty, and it's a bunch of nothing. That is not true. What it's a benefit for are a few profiteers in the military-industrial complex, in the financial industry, and political powerhouses. So it would be much better for us as a country to wake up and say, you know, the foreign policy, especially of the last 100 years, has not served us well. It has served us in a very detrimental fashion, and we need to challenge it, and hopefully this will come about. Of course, I've always argued that the likelihood of Congress waking up and the American people waking up and us gradually coming to our senses and backing off in a more graceful manner, it's not likely to happen. But eventually we'll win this argument because we won't be able to afford it. It's not doing us any good. It's costing us a lot of money, and it's not accomplishing anything that the neocons claim that it's supposed to accomplish. So I want to thank everybody today for tuning in to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.